read to you a quote. This comes from the book Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War from Patrick J. Buchanan. The quote is not his. One may dislike Hitler's system, yet admire his patriotic achievement. If our country were defeated, I hope we should find a champion as indomitable to restore our courage and lead us back to our place among the nations. Now, you might want to ask who this quote is from. You know, maybe Hitler, one of his right-hand men, maybe Goebbels, his propaganda minister, maybe even Stalin, who was head of the Soviet Union at the time. The fact is, those words are from Winston Churchill in 1937. And you can look at those words and ask the question, how could they possibly, or how could he possibly have got everything so incredibly wrong? And the answer is actually relatively simple. He was human. Now I say that in light of today's second reading. Today's second reading, we look at Paul talking about the wisdom of God. The wisdom of God, which is so much greater than all human wisdom, even collectively. In fact, if you read the passage, and you'll see actually Paul, from his own words, and he also quotes Isaiah and the book of Job, you can sum it up in another passage from Isaiah, from the 55th chapter. For my ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts. God's wisdom is greater than everything we can imagine. Therefore, when we humble ourselves before it and open ourselves to it, then we are open to the source of the greatest of wisdom. And may not say something like that. One of the reasons why we need to look at that is look what's going on right now. We're in the midst of this presidential campaign. And we've got the next 2 weeks of the two parties' conventions. And in the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at more and more who will our leaders be. But we do have to understand, regardless of whom we choose, neither one of them is going to be the greatest source of wisdom, because neither one of them is God. And therefore, even though we can turn around and say we can put our hopes in them politically, we can't put our hopes in them to make a perfect world, because only God can do that. And we need to look at that in light of what they stand for and whom we listen to. One of the interesting things we can look at is in light of some of the events that have happened in the past 30 years. When Pope John Paul II became Pope and he started to travel about the world and he was proclaiming Catholic teaching, among that was, of course, Catholic morality. And many people took what he said about Catholic morality, especially in light of sexual morality and sex out of marriage, etc., and they summed it up in a very simple English phrase. The Pope says no, meaning sexual immorality. The Pope says no. And many people who disagree with Catholic teaching, who reject Catholic teaching, would turn around and say, why does he mind his own business? Then in what we call the aughts, the early part of this decade, when the U.S. was looking into doing a preemptive strike against Iraq, the Pope said, do not walk down that path. There will be great human destruction. Do not walk down that path. And the same people who said in the 1980s, the Pope said no, said, why doesn't he mind his own business? And we look at that and say, you know, when it comes to wisdom, which is from God, and I'm not saying that Pope is speaking infallibly in those situations, speaking prayerfully in those situations, we can't accept some of it and reject some of it. We have to recognize that God's wisdom is greater than everything that we can have. And as Paul says, we look at it in that context, and there we humble ourselves before it and listen to what his words are. Last weekend there was this conference, and there was this preacher, as you may remember, was interviewing two of the candidates. And he asked them this question, the answer of which both of them answered to is, Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior. I don't know if he asked this question, but I think it would be an important question to ask. What is the source of your wisdom? There's a reason for that. If we go back in the middle of the 20th century, and we were to ask Gandhi a question in regards to who, if Jesus was his personal Lord and Savior, he would have said no. Gandhi was a Hindu, and the reason why he was a Hindu is because he was treated so poorly by Christians in South Africa. Gandhi would have said no. But if you asked him, where is the source of your wisdom, he would have said God. So we come back to those words, and we hear the words of Paul, and again he reminds us of this wisdom. But I want you to notice something. Paul is not speaking to the Roman Senate. He's not speaking to the procurator. He's not speaking to the emperor. He's writing a letter to the Christian Romans. Therefore, he is writing the letter to the ancient version of you. And so when we look at that, we see that Paul is essentially writing also to you. In light of that, we can pick whatever candidate we want from whatever party we want, but we have to turn around and say our response to God's wisdom is essential. And we have to turn around and say our hopes in whatever candidate don't mean anything if we are not before the Lord humbly and saying, I will choose to follow God's wisdom. Because that is our call. That's what we stand for. And if we don't do that, then we can create great disasters. For example, the signs were clearly there in Nazi Germany. These are during the times that they were making the laws to legalize just about everything for the Jews. The signs were clearly there that the last leader you would ever want leading your country, even if you were defeated, was Adolf Hitler. But somehow, Winston Churchill didn't pick up on that. And so it is with us. How we need to realize the importance of who we listen to. Because remember one thing. The vast majority, 85% of non-Catholic Christians voted for Hitler in 1933. The vast majority of Catholic Christians voted against Hitler in 1933. But ultimately the question is, whom do we listen to? And Paul reminds us we need to listen humbly to the wisdom of God.